Good evening, councillors and members of the public watching on the webcast. My name is Fiona Cameron. I'm the Senior Governance Officer at Waverley. Just before we start the meeting, I'd just like to explain that usual committee chairman, Councillor Paul Rivers, is unable to attend this evening due to the COVID restrictions. And our Vice Chairman had already given apologies. So we're very grateful that Councillor Liz Townsend and Councillor Richard Seaborn have kindly agreed to stand in as Chairman and Vice Chairman in order that the meeting can proceed this evening. Can I just ask committee members, just for the sake of formality, that you confirm Councillor Townsend and Councillor Seaborn as Chairman and Vice Chairman for the meeting this evening? Thank you very much. Councillor Townsend, if you'd like to carry on.
Thank you, Fiona. And welcome to this meeting of the Eastern Committee. As Fiona said, my name is Councillor Liz Townsend and I'm chairing this committee this evening, and I'm supported by Councillor Richard Seaborn as Vice Chair. I'm also joined by officers this evening: Lewis Jones, the Planning Solicitor; Chris French, the Area Team Leader; Rachel Lawrence, our Principal Planning Officer; Lara Davidson, Planning Officer; Susie Blackwood, Planning Officer; Daniel Holmes, Senior Planning Officer; and obviously Fiona Cameron, our Senior Governance Officer; and Georgina Hall, our Democratic Service Officer, who's also clerking the meeting this evening. I would ask members to keep their statements brief and to the point, and we will be timing speeches this evening, and as you're usually aware, there will be an alarm or sound when you've been speaking for 4 minutes. Thank you. Have we got any apologies for absence and substitutions this evening?
Yes, apologies have been received from Councillor David Else, Councillor Christine Baker, Councillor Trevor Sadler, Councillor Michael Goodrich, Councillor Paul Rivers and Councillor George Wilson. Councillor Richard Seaborn, Councillor Chris Hard and Councillor Mary Forszewski are standing as substitutes.
Thank you. Can I ask members if they can confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of November 2021, which have been published on the website? Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest?
None received.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest, members? Thank you. Any questions by members of the public?
None received.
Thank you. Any questions by members?
None received.
Can I ask officers if there's any relevant updates to government guidance or any legislation since the last meeting that you want to advise us about? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. There's one update. The Environment Bill received royal assent on the 10th of November, with Schedule 1 coming into force straight away, and the remaining schedules to be enforced through secondary legislation, which is yet to be updated, with particular reference to biodiversity net gain, the 10% net gain mandatory figure. This will require updates to the Town and Country Planning Act and the MPPF before it becomes a mandatory requirement. The projected timeline is estimated to be around 2 years for that to take place. Therefore, whilst the MPPF gives us the tool to encourage some net gain, the mandatory requirement for securing a measurable 10% net gain is not yet in place. Nevertheless, officers will be pushing for a 10% net gain wherever possible in our discussions with developers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Members, are you okay with that? Did anybody want to ask any questions or anything? No, thank you. Okay, then we'll move on to the main part of the evening, which is the applications for planning permission. I don't think we've got any public speakers on this one, Georgina. Yes, thank you. Yes. So we'll move on then to the presentation. This is for WA 2021-01509, which is Firethorn Farm, and 44 and 45 Larkfield. So I'll hand over to our Principal Planning Officer, Rachel Lawrence, and she'll give the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good evening. Before I go through the presentation in detail, I'll just talk you through the update sheet. I believe you've got some hard copies in front of you. Firstly, you'll see there's a correction to the planning history. Essentially, the allowed appeal was against the wrong reference number. It is a 49 unit one, which we're talking about tonight, which was allowed on appeal rather than a larger scheme. In terms of amended plans, there have been minor amendments to provide appropriate visibility displays, and you'll see on your update that means that the removal of condition 7, which was to secure appropriate visibility displays. There's one additional representation there which talks about matters including boundary treatments and the location of the footpath. So some of those matters are addressed within the most up-to-date boundary details which are shown on the proposed plans. And you've got specific references there if you do want to make reference to them. And when I come on to the presentation, I'll point out the footpath, which was a cause of the concern in this representation. I think that'll be easier than trying to explain it on a piece of paper. So the result of that, through having some changes to the plan numbers, is that there are updates to the plans listed in conditions 11 and 14, and so those are highlighted for you on the agenda report. You'll see condition 7 is removed due to the additional information having been provided on visibility displays, and condition 10 is corrected to make reference to plots 21 to 27. That condition relates to the removal of permitted development rights adjacent to a TPO. Again, I'll point this out on the presentation so you can see it in visual plan form. I think I've not moved through that too quickly. Another point just to make, and it's not on your update sheet before we try and find it on there. There is a further update in terms of the Ewhurst and Ellen's Green Neighbourhood Plan that has been formally submitted to Waverley Borough Council, and a 6-week consultation is currently underway on that. I believe that runs until the end of December, 23rd of December. The effect of that is that it is still at an early stage such that the weight to be attached is very limited. As such, what you won't see in the report at this stage is a detailed assessment against those policies. The stage at which that would potentially increase is once the plan is submitted for examination, and if the inspector provides a favourable report back, that's really the point at which we start giving that more substantial weight. And with that, I will move on to the presentation itself. So the proposal is for 49 new dwellings, including 15.
Excuse me, Rachel. Could
Sorry.
I just interrupt you there? Councillor Hegan would like to ask a question.
By all means.
I just wanted to make an observation when you're running through the list of amendments. I think recommendation B should read, in the event the requirements of recommendation A are not met, rather than recommendation B. On page 32.
Apologies, turn the microphone back on. I've got the agenda or the recommendation written on screen, so if it's okay, I'll come back to that. And yes, but that does sound correct, what you've suggested. So it is for 49 new dwellings, including 15 affordable dwellings. Those are the same numbers that were set at the outline application stage, and they were a fixed number as opposed to an up to, as you do see with some outline applications. The detailed matter considered at that stage was the vehicular access via the Green Horsham Lane. Okay, so on screen now, just to point out a few points here. These are the two existing dwellings, numbers 44 and 45 Larkfield, to be demolished, although they have actually already been demolished as part of the proposal. You'll see just here, this is where the proposed access would be taken. And this is the nearest, so one of the nearest estates, Larkfield, that's a residential estate just there. And similarly, you'll see that highlighted in red on the right-hand side of the screen. Take you through a few existing site photographs. These are all taken looking into the fields beyond the existing housing. So you'll see there's a range of boundary fence and field division lines which run there. This line I'm roughly following with my finger, or the cursor, does denote the edge of the boundary site. And on the bottom right of the screen, as you'll see, this is looking with the properties of Larkfield on the right hand side. A similar range of photographs again. You'll see better the existing houses of Larkfield which do back onto the field. What you'll see is the adjacent farm in the far distance there. So the application site wouldn't extend the full extent of the fields. It follows this roughly diagonal line here, and then you would retain open fields beyond, which are shown with these field lines. To show you a little bit more about the outline planning application, so that was granted on appeal on the 22nd of Feb 2019. As mentioned, that includes 49 new dwellings, including 15 affordable dwellings, open space, landscaping and vehicular access via the Green Horsham Road. All matters were reserved except for the access. As such, this layout plan, which is shown on the screen, was an indicative plan only. It's worth noting on this plan that there was no local area of play or local equipped area of play provided or shown on the plans at that stage, whilst officers were always satisfied that it was capable of providing those on site. There haven't needed to be some changes from this indicative plan that you see before you on here. So moving to the proposed plans that we're looking at tonight, you'll see here you've got a perimeter block layout, how the dwellings are arranged. Vast majority of the dwellings are 2-storey with a couple with accommodation in the roof space as well. You'll see the access coming through from that approved point onto the main road just here. So the play spaces mentioned have been negotiated as part of this reserved matters application, and they include a local area of play, which is just here in the central area of open space, and a locally equipped area of play in the southern portion of the site. You'll notice that the southern portion of the site remains largely undeveloped, and that's quite similar to what you saw on the indicative plan at the outline application stage. One of the main reasons for that is it allows for ecology mitigation to be provided within that southern part of the site. The further benefit as well for the local residents of Larkfield is that actually the open aspect over those fields is largely retained, with the development focused further north. You'll see as well there's a landscape buffer which is retained or provided along this eastern edge. In the photographs you would have just seen this as some fencing, so it's not a particularly formal boundary and certainly not a landscape boundary there as it stands. And I'll come back to that in slightly more detail in due course. Just looking at a slightly wider picture, what I've shown here is the outline of the site in red on the constraints plan. And what I draw your attention to is the proximity of the AONB and AGLV, neither of which the site falls within, but they are within a reasonable proximity of the site. So the AONB is a section just here, so it's the one coloured green and also shaded crosshatch green as well to the north. That's around half a kilometre away in terms of, to give you some idea on distance. So main views from that part are towards that northern edge and then also the eastern edge. At the outline stage, when that was granted, there were no objections raised either by the AONB officer or by Natural England. You will see there is an objection to the current application in terms of the extent of the landscape buffer on the eastern edge. So I'll come on to talk about that in slightly more detail in due course. However, the main points to draw out from this plan at this stage are the fairly significant distances you'll see from the AONB and AGLV to the application site, as I say. And it is worth noting at this stage that there was no requirement from the appeal decision to limit the developed area to a particular extent or retain a particular depth of landscape buffer on this eastern side. So sticking with landscape in a bit more detail, you'll see in terms of additional new planting that's being focused along this eastern boundary, and with the retention of existing trees which run along the northern boundary, these two are really the most sensitive in terms of providing a transition from the proposed residential development to the housing, to the open fields which are just beyond and to the east, and also in terms of any views from the AO and B. So the comments from the AO and B officer do focus on those views from the A and B to the north, which is in this direction. So the first boundary, which we're really likely to see, is this northern boundary, where you'll see the retention of quite mature trees along there. And what you've got as well is this new additional planting buffer along the eastern side. What you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got a few images of some of the proposed trees. So primarily what you can see are the examples of the ornamental trees, and those are shown with the pink dots on the plan, with the more native species focused around the woodland areas and on that eastern boundary. And I'll just highlight a few of the distances as well of this buffer, and to sort of explain to what extent this has changed since the outline scheme. So at this point here, the widest distance between the residential houses and the edge of the site is a distance around 32 metres. And that is roughly comparable with the indicative outline that was shown at outline stage at the appeal. And the distance ranges at a smaller point, I believe that measures 6 metres, and then further out you're looking at about 12 to 14 metres as sort of the average point running along there. So the officer view is that this does provide a strong basis and landscape buffer. Oh, we've gone too far. It's worth noting that we do have a condition in terms of the landscape maintenance that requires the replacement of any of those trees which die within the first 10 years. You may well be aware that most of our conditions generally have controls for the initial 5-year period. However, given the sensitivity of that landscape buffer, we have gone for an increased period in this case. And that is an approach that has been used by appeal inspectors before. So it's not the first time. However, that enhanced approach is considered appropriate based on the site circumstances. And just to run through some of the trees that you can, or the more common tree names for those native species that you'll see along that eastern side. You're looking at hornbeam, hazel, maple trees, crab apple, wild cherry. So you've got quite a mixture along this eastern boundary proposed. Moving on to affordable housing provision, you'll notice that your agenda is that the recommendation, is subject to the completion of the deed of variation. So at the outline application stage, what was secured was 15 affordable units with the 70% affordable rent and 30% intermediate or shared ownership housing. That remains the case with this current application. What is being changed, however, are the size of the bedroom, the size of the affordable units. So that's in terms of bedroom numbers. So what we have got is an increase in the percentage of 2 and 3 bedroom units and a reduction in the percentage of the 1-bed units. There is a more detailed table for you in your agenda report. What we have negotiated as well by virtue of that increase and change to the size of the units is a cap on the affordable rent homes at 70% of the local market rate, and that's for the 1 and the 2 bedroom units, and for the 65 and for the 3 bedroom units, capping that at 65%, and that does include a service charge. So that aligns with what is being promoted through the recent affordable housing SPD that's come forward, and it really seeks to address the affordability issues in that rural location. So, and it's for that reason that the affordable housing mix does have the support of our housing enabling team, and we welcome securing that provision as part of the deed of variation in due course. Just briefly highlight how it's distributed amongst the site. You'll see it's distributed among 3 key areas, primarily in the north. I've only given you an extract of the plan so you can see how it is distributed, but along that left-hand or western side, you will see the majority of the affordable units. A couple more units here in the centre of the scheme and below, so both fronting onto the open space within the site. The approach with 3 clusters is considered appropriate given the relatively low number of units of 15. However, they're still centrally located and provide good access centrally within the site and onto the open space. Looking now, this plan shows you the storey height of the proposed units. So the houses you'll see in green are the 2-storey height. The only place where this is exceeded is on the right-hand side, eastern edge. You'll see these 2 properties here, which are 2.5-storey. So that comprises where you've got the accommodation in the roof space. The yellow units you see are the sort of garages and outbuildings at the 1.5 or 1-storey height, respectively. Turning to the parking plan, you'll see a total of 145 spaces, and they're shown. The blue are the allocated car parking spaces, the pink are where they're proposed in garages, and the green are where you've got on-street visitor bays. The total of 145 does exceed the requirement from the council's parking guidelines. You'll see there are some locations where you do see triple tandem parking. So here you've got 2 spaces in front of the pink labelled garages. So in line with our guidance, we don't count those towards meeting the provision. However, even once you knock those spaces off, I think it works out at about 6 or 7 there. You do still stay well in excess of the parking guidelines. So in effect, it provides some extra flexibility in terms of visitor parking over and above what we would ordinarily require. You might find it a little bit difficult to see, they're quite small annotated. However, each unit marked up in yellow, you will see individual stores for bicycles. And that's provided for all the units which they don't have a direct access to garages. So there is that facility there for cycle usage within the site. It's worth noting at the outline application stage, the provision of electric vehicle charging points were secured at 1 space per dwelling. So that does align with the current Surrey guidelines that have come out quite recently. And there's flexibility within the wording of like conditions that we can push for the fast charging as well in due course. Turning to the external lighting, appreciate the symbols are quite small on this plan. What you'll see is that the focus of the lighting is very much adjacent to the dwellings, and what you won't see is any sort of street lighting on this stretch leading up to the main road. Given its location with visibility from the AONB, and also within a rural location where it does have that low lighting at the moment, it is a particularly sensitive location in terms of lighting. So what you're primarily looking at is sort of bollard lighting about 1 metre high. Just pausing as the screens come off on here. Be a short pause, apologies.
Sorry, members, we've got a bit of a technical hitch, but I'm sure it'll be sorted out in a moment.
I'll continue as far as I can before I need some visual aids to carry on. So the visual lighting, as I say, it is a sensitive point there. We have got some indicative details from the applicant in terms of where that lighting will be placed in the site. We're not conditioning that plan at this stage, and we are requiring further detail from them. Primarily what's missing at this stage is detail on light spill and those sorts of factors. So there are safeguards within the ecological management plans which they'll be required to adhere to in terms of the lighting. So you will see on your agenda report that there does remain a condition for lighting. However, that just gives you an indication of the sort of lighting that we'll be looking at on the proposal. I think what I was going to move on to and show you next is the street scene images, which might require a lot of imagination to look at the moment. But essentially what you will see from the architecture that's proposed is quite a traditional mix of houses. You'll see lots of chimneys, gable features, tile hanging, really in keeping with what you'll see in sort of the nearby conservation areas and that sort of traditional Surrey vernacular approach. I will talk them through once we get it loaded up as well. I was jumping too quickly. Oh, I see. Do you want to load it up? No, where it is.
Rachel, does it help at all that we have got some street scene pictures on page 11 of our agenda that members could look at?
Yes, yeah, I'll see how far we can get from that. That's a good idea. Yes, if I can direct your attention to page 11 of the report, that's the number at the bottom as opposed to the internal page number. You'll see some of those proposed street scenes. You'll see there's a fairly consistent mix. In terms of roof form, you're looking at a mixture of slate and clay tiles as the main two roof forms. You'll see you've got chimneys on a couple of featured dwellings, but not on every dwelling as you move through. And it really highlights that point that you're looking at primarily the two-storey, more traditional building as opposed to anything higher than that. I've got more street scenes to show you on the PowerPoint presentation, and that includes the 2.5 unit when we get there, which is on the eastern edge of the site. I think we're very nearly there with the presentation. Perfect.
Yes, Councillor Howard.
May I ask a question while we're
Yes.
waiting? I'm just intrigued to know who will be managing the playgrounds once it's just intrigued, because I know from parish council experience how much work they take and inspections and the cost of replacing them, etc.
Yes, I don't think there's been any indication from the parish council that they want to take that on. It's my understanding. I don't believe they've actually fixed or appointed a particular company yet, but as part of the outline application, they're required to appoint a company to manage that. So I think that's still to be determined.
Because I have noticed in other developments I've seen in various parts of the country that they quickly deteriorate and become an eyesore. It does seem to be a bit of a problem with some of these developments. It looks lovely at the start. But...
Certainly. So the legal agreement that is in place through the outline and the subsequent reserve matters will both have those provisions to secure that management plan moving forwards. And I think we're just about ready to move back to the street scenes, which I'll just do a bit of leaning across. Yeah, we're just going to switch mics, so just one moment. Right, so jumping back, I've spoken a little bit about the street scene images, but I'll just show you where they sit in terms of the application site. The street scene B, you'll see at the top, is on the right hand side of this row just here. So those are the market rather than the affordable dwellings that you can see on that bit. Street scene A, these are a couple of dwellings which you would see along that access into the site. So there's just a couple there, in a similar way to there being 2 existing dwellings on site. Street scenes C and D, those are either side of the central road which runs through the middle of the site just here. So you'll see from this that there is some variation in topography, and the roof lines do follow a fairly gentle gradient as they step down following the land levels there. And just at the bottom here, this top image here is the eastern edge of the site. So this is the view which should be going along this section here and looking out towards the open fields beyond. These 2 units here are the 2.5 story units mentioned with the accommodation in the roof space. And what you'll see is that based on those sections, they do more or less align with the proportions of the other units as you move through, albeit in this case they're able to accommodate that accommodation within the roof space. And as a point of comparison, the Larkfield development, which is just located around here, fronting onto the site, is comparable in terms of that overarching ridge height achieved in those 2.5 story units. In terms of control over those final heights, you'll note that there is a condition in the agenda, I believe it's number 13, which will control the finished floor levels of the unit and ultimately the ridge heights as well, to provide that level of control given the topography and sensitivity there. Okay, so to take you through now what the key matters for consideration are in this application. So firstly, affordable housing, and that's in terms of the acceptability of the change to the mix of affordable provision. The housing mix, that's looking at the size of units more generally. You will note that it does focus on the larger 3-bedroom plus units rather than a high number of 1 or 2 bedroom units that we do see in some other schemes. In terms of design and impact on visual amenity, one point it's worth noting is that what you'll see through the development is a lot of landscape boundaries, so hedges as opposed to your fences on the public facing boundaries for residential properties. But you'll see the focus on the 2-story provision and the traditional architecture that exists. In terms of landscaping, amenity and play space, you'll see appropriate provision in terms of a local area of play and a local equipped area of play, both provided on the site, as well as integrated landscaping within the scheme, which is one benefit of the change from the outline indicative layout seen previously. In terms of the impact on the setting of the AONB and the AGLV, as noted, they both fall outside of those designations. However, you are within 0.5 kilometre and I think 0.3 kilometres respectively from each of those designations. The principle of development within those distances from the boundaries was considered acceptable at the outline stage. And as I say, the comments from the AONB officer level do need to be balanced against the landscaping buffer highlighted those distances and the appropriateness of the layout in other respects. In terms of the impact on residential amenity, we noted that there is quite good separation both to properties west of the site and also to the north. You've got quite substantial tree buffers in a number of places. And in terms of Larkfield, which is probably one of the nearest settlements to it, you will have seen the focus of the built form towards the north of the site and actually retaining those views to the east of Larkfield, which exists at the moment. In terms of car parking, the provision does accord with the Waverley car parking standards, and as well with in terms of electric vehicle charging does secure that one space per unit. In terms of the standard of accommodation, including accessibility, it's worth noting you'll see there's a full schedule for anyone who wants to work through it appended to the report, demonstrating how the size of the units accords with the space standards, and that includes both the market and affordable units in that respect. And they do also meet the accessibility standards in terms of M42, the building control standard that requires them to be accessible. And so all the units do meet that requirement. In terms of biodiversity, the layout of the scheme preserves the biodiversity enhancements that were secured at the outline stage. And you'll note that it does have the support of the Surrey Wildlife Trust subject to the condition involving sensitive lighting, which is also necessary, not just from a dark skies perspective in a rural location, but in terms of protecting bats and a movement through the site. It has that aspect as well. In terms of sustainability, you'll notice in your report there are a number of sustainability measures outlined, the fabric first approach being the primary means they're looking at sustainable runoff controlled, and you will see that there is a condition requiring either permeable surfaces throughout the development or an appropriate runoff from each of them when that can't be provided. And just to jump to the recommendation now. The revised recommendation A is as shown on your update sheet. Well, I'll just quickly take you through that. That is that subject to the completion of a deed of variation to secure updates to the affordable housing provision. That's within 6 months of this committee, and subject to the amended conditions 10, 11 and 14 on the update sheet, and conditions 1 to 6, 8 to 9 and 12 to 13 on the agenda report. That reserved matters approval is granted. I have made reference to an additional informative regarding car parking standards, which we could also add, which would just draw the applicant's attention to the updated standards of Surrey County Council that have come out recently. The condition is imposed on the outline rather than this application, which is why I'd recommend that as an informative, just to draw their attention to that guidance for when they come to discharge that condition. And yes, it's quite correctly pointed out earlier, there is an error on this recommendation A. It should say, in the event that the requirements of recommendation A are not met, that permission be refused for the following reason, which relates to the affordable housing. Thank you. I think that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. We have one speaker, that's Councillor Val Henry, the ward councillor, who would like to speak. So you have 4 minutes, Councillor Henry, and then obviously if you want to reserve the right to come back later on when we finish the debate, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. So yes, I'm Val Henry. I'm the ward member for Ewhurst, also a parish councillor, and I am representing my residents. So the perspective is on the people, and it's a report from the ground, so to speak, rather than planning issues. So my overriding concern for this new development, which will take the better part of 3 years, is that it's carried out smoothly and amicably. The breach of conditions in the planning inspector's report has not gone down well in the village, and the residents, they're law-abiding people, and so I don't think the developers got off to a very good start with the immediate neighbours, and we've not mentioned the neighbours at Maldrick's, Pond Cottage and Williams Place, so there are a few more people than just the Larkfield people. And throughout the build, I need to push home that we need some robust directives. There must be no wriggle room. We have, where I live, I have 4 building sites around me, so I can speak with a certain amount of feeling. This site is right at the centre of the village, and many people could be inconvenienced by these works. And I don't want to see that happen. That corner is known as Crasher's Corner for those people that might know Ewhurst. So as I've said, I have experience of 4 building sites around me, and I don't want the misdemeanors of all those back on us. Whilst the construction, transport and environmental management plan is not an integral part of the application, I feel it's very vital to the whole of the application, and this has not been available on the planning site, and that this is something that really needs to be dealt with in a very robust way. We do not want parking on the streets, and all vehicles must be parked on site. I know I've not had an opportunity to deal with that, but I feel very strongly about that, and I need to drive that home. I know the local people will support this application if Waverley can demonstrate they're taking notice of their modest requests. And I would ask for 2 additional conditions. One is the formation of a liaison group to include the developer and to be headed up by the parish council. And 2 is the management of the trees. There is a ribbon boundary of trees between properties 21 to 29. And these don't belong to the developer, but to other people. And I want to ensure that the integrity of these trees, which all have TPOs on them, are not interfered with, as we've experienced elsewhere in Ewhurst. And I'm sure other people have experienced trees and hedges coming down during the lockdown period. Ewhurst is a rural village, and the residents are wanting to maintain that identity. I could list lots of miscellaneous detail, but I know other people will need to get in there. So let me park it there, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Members, before we get started, perhaps Rachel, you could explain the construction, transport, environmental management plan and the role of that within this application. Thank you.
Yes, certainly happy to. So one of the conditions on the outline application was for the submission of a construction, transport and environmental management plan. That has been submitted and approved by officers. I mean, that was approved sometime in the summer. I won't go through it in too much detail. You'll see it's a fairly lengthy one there. So to clarify, it is on the planning website, but what it is on the outline application reference. So that's what it was discharged in relation to, as opposed to the reserve matters. So I think that has caused some confusion for residents who might have been trying to find access to that document. However, it certainly is there and available to have a look at, and happy to provide links to that in due course. Just to give you a very few headlines on that, the first stage of development for this proposal will be that access into the site. And that will take you into that triangular section of the site. Once that access is in place, they will then be able to have all their car parking and construction activities on site, which is obviously what is necessary in order to minimise that disturbance to the wider community. At the moment, the 2 existing properties, 44 and 45, are accessed through Larkfield. They've been demolished now, but if you can see the remainder of where they were in due course. So until that access gets constructed in accordance with the relevant 278 agreement from the Highway Authority, that access from Larkfield is where it will start off as. So yeah, absolutely recognise that the desirability of that to move from using that access to using the on-plot car parking for construction vehicles is a priority. We'd also support an informative to be added to the decision if members would like, which would encourage the setting up of an appropriate liaison group. Certainly there have been existing meetings to date between the applicants who are developing out the site and the residents. And certainly that seemed like a productive exercise and would absolutely make sense to encourage that continuing in due course. I can also briefly cover the tree aspects now, if that's appropriate. So to the rear of, I don't know if you want to just pull up stop showing a screen, I'll point this out, but to the west of the site, behind the properties which front onto the green and the proposed development, is the area of the TPO trees. You will see in the update report that one of the amendments to the conditions does relate to restricting permitted development rights, either for new hard surfaces or for outbuildings in the rear of those properties which back onto that TPO area there. I'll tell you exactly which number it is in just one moment. So that's condition 10. It's removing the permitted development rights for hard surfaces or outbuildings. It doesn't mean that they can't come forward with proposals for outbuildings in the gardens, but rather they will need to come in for planning permission, which will give us that control over their construction method and where they're located to ensure the protection of those trees in due course. We do also have a tree protection condition on the agenda report, which I will give you that reference number as well. and that's condition 9. One of the factors that requires is for the council's tree officer to be notified once the protective fencing is in place, so they can come out and inspect that and ensure that appropriate protection is there and in place. So officers are therefore satisfied that we do have the appropriate conditions in place to meet that requirement in terms of the TPO on site. Thank you. I think that's all for now.
Thank you, Rachel. Members, Councillor Cossa.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think my starting point on this is this. In terms of considering those matters that we probably ought to be considering at detailed stage, having looked at the officer's report, having managed to get there for the last 10 minutes of the site visit after a 2.5-hour round journey, I haven't actually found anything that in those terms I would cause me to not support the officer recommendations. There are, however, just 2 points I want to raise. One, I think, more significant for me than the other. The fairly minor one is I did notice in the list of key items for consideration, one of the things listed was impact on the AONB and AGLV. I just need some better understanding of this, really. I would have thought those were issues that were probably debated at outline stage and are more properly debated at outline stage. And I'm just quite worried because we've run into this sort of issue in this committee before, that we start to revisit things that actually are not properly for detailed. So that's my first point. My second one, and the thing that does cause me more concern, is the issue around affordable housing. This is the second time recently in this committee we have had a change in the arrangements that we thought were in place for affordable housing. Now, on the first application that came before the committee, we, as we have tonight, had a sentence to the effect in the report that our housing officers supported the change. Now, as a committee at that stage, we clearly didn't. I think we understood and we knew what we wanted to do. This one fills me with a little bit of questioning rather than concern. I can understand in principle the notion that if we can get lower rents in an area of obviously some high cost and so on, that is a potential advantage. But I really don't seem to have enough information to weigh that against the change which is a move from smaller units of affordable housing through to bigger units, which in a sense exacerbates that problem and makes that more necessary. And as a general point, I don't know if our officers can help us on this, but I think this is quite key for the committee and for the council more fundamentally. And I think where we're going to get these changes, I would have wanted to see at the very least some more information and a statement from our housing officers weighing up those pros and cons so that we could better make the judgment, and or the option at least to have a housing officer who we might actually be able to ask some questions of. As it is, generally speaking, as I say, I don't have a problem with the detail, but on that one particular point, I find it very, very difficult to accept that because I don't feel I have enough understanding of the implications and pros and cons of the change. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cossa. Rachel, would you be able to provide any more details of the change in the affordable housing units and the social rents as well? Thank you.
I'll certainly try. I would direct you to page 17 on the agenda report. What you've got there is a more detailed comparison of the mix that was secured in the outline 106 agreement and a comparison with what's now proposed as part of the reserved matters affordable housing application. So what you'll see is the percentages in terms of the 70% and the 30% remain the same. The overall number remains the same. Just to give you a bit of a flavour for the degree of change between the units. In terms of the 1-bedroom units, you're correct, we are looking at reduction. So we were looking at 40% 1-bedroom units at the outline stage. That's reduced to 13%. And the 2-bedroom units, it's a change from 27% at the outline stage, increasing to 47%. So yeah, it's the 2 and the 3-bedroom units that we're seeing more of relative to what we had agreed at the outline application stage. So there's a few factors which come into the equation. we have to have a look at it in terms of the appropriateness of those units for the site. It is worth noting that there is quite a considerable need for affordable housing of all sizes. So what we're not doing is securing an increase in units which are not required to some degree to meet the need in the borough. And the feeling, or the advice from our affordable team was that those reductions in the rent were sufficiently appealing to outweigh that degree of change. I don't know if that helps slightly. I mean, the 65% in particular was fairly critical, particularly on the 3-bedroom units, because I think once you get to those larger units, the affordability is that greater an issue on the larger units. So achieving that, securing that rent level did carry a lot of weight in the eyes of the enabling officers. And yeah, I suppose it would emphasise that on this site, it's certainly from a visual perspective, the 2 and the 3-bedroom units do integrate well with the scheme as a whole. So there are some benefits there in terms of the visual aspect. And as I say, it is still meeting an identified affordable housing need, albeit on a different site and place to where it might otherwise be. Thank you.
Councillor Costa, does that answer your question?
Well, not for me, I'm afraid. I think you've, as best you can, restated what is in the report, and which I read in the report and I understand. And I think my point substantially is that there is a balance here, and I wanted more understanding of why that change has been made. I can see the advantages, and not have a fuller statement and or the opportunity to question the officer is a detriment to me, and I can't change my view on that. But thank you for trying to state it.
Thank you for your point, and obviously it's something that the officers can take perhaps forward. Councillor Hegan and Councillor Darcy.
Thank you, Chair. I also considered the point that Councillor Costa's alluded to. I think the key difference between this and the Milford application is there's no reduction in overall numbers. And I am therefore persuaded that actually a 65% discount on a larger unit that we don't usually see in the affordable mix does reassure me on that point. My concern for this is more on the housing mix overall and the huge increase in the 4-bedroom properties. And then those 4-bedroom properties themselves are 150% of the recommended space standards, whereas the smaller dwellings are at or below those standards. And I just have a feel of a very unbalanced development that gives me a concern.
Thank you, Councillor Hegan. Rachel, have you got any comments on the mix of housing? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, you do correctly identify that there is a higher percentage of the larger units on this site than what the SHMAR recommends. There is a degree of tolerance with the SHMAR, and it is there as guidance. The view of officers looking at the scheme as a whole is that the layout responds appropriately to the context. So it is a factor there to be weighed into the balance. However, it wasn't one which, in officers' view, would justify refusal on its own grounds. I believe that having a look through, the space standards are met for all the dwellings, albeit I take the point that there are some that exceed that number more considerably than others, and that does include the 4-bedroom units.
Councillor Darcy.
Thank you. I was looking through the many documents with this, and I was very excited to discover there was a landscape and ecology management plan, which is possibly the first time I've ever found one. Obviously, this is because it comes from the previous outline application. However, it's included in condition 11 and therefore is relevant, I believe. I must say my joy turned to disappointment when I read through it and compared it to the mitigation statement and habitat creation plan upon which it's based, and which is mentioned in the appeal, indeed as condition 12 of the appeal document. It bears very little, well, it bears a lot of resemblance, but it doesn't meet the standards of that originating document. I would say that the LEMP is not up to the standard I would expect, and it doesn't deliver the biodiversity mitigation that's required. I did ask if I mean, I had a look through it and it's got a lot of faults, which I've sent my comments to the officer. I did ask if Surrey Wildlife Trust, our ecological consultants, had a detailed look at it, and I'm still not clear if they have. I'd be concerned on 2 points. If they haven't, they should have, and all LEMPs should surely go to Surrey Wildlife Trust for detailed examination. And secondly, if they have and they've approved it, then I think we need to have a long, hard talk with them. There's quite a few things in there which I wouldn't have allowed if I was reviewing it. So I would like it to be established that LEMPs are examined in detail by Surrey Wildlife Trust, first of all, and I would also like us to do some little exercise whereby we quality assure this, because it's of concern to me. So could I have a response on that? Thanks.
Rachel, would you like to respond to Councillor Darcy?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for the question. I haven't been able to discuss with Surrey Wildlife Trust, for following your email, a direct response to the points you've raised. What we do when we consult them on applications, we consult them on the whole application. We don't invite them to look at single documents. They are asked to look at the full package. And for that reason, I can't also confirm the degree to which they have looked at that document, but there is reference to it within their reports. What I would say is if you consider the details to be unsatisfactory, what we can do is impose a condition for a fresh landscape environmental management plan to be submitted and approved in writing, which again will be submitted and for detailed consideration of Surrey Wildlife Trust. So also just to distinguish between what's been established at the outline and what's within this application. So the details submitted, the ecological enhancements secured at the outline stage, which you've made that comparison with, they have been secured and approved through that appeal route. Whilst Surrey Wildlife Trust have not raised any objection to the landscape ecological management plan, it is submitted pursuant to this reserve matter, so it is within the gift list committee to reach a view on that. I don't think there's too much more I can add in terms of a detailed response from what I've already said.
Thank you, Rachel. Councillor Darcy, would you like to propose that condition?
I would, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure that Rachel will note that and put it down. Have you got a seconder for that? Councillor Howard. Thank you. Councillor Denis.
Thank you very much. Couple of condition questions if I start, because one was raised by Councillor Henry, which is about the condition for residents liaison group. And I suppose as a committee we should propose that. So it's agreed. I would suggest possibly a no construction traffic or on-site visitor traffic to park on public roads to be parked within the site is a condition I think we should be proposing. And a third one, which hasn't been mentioned, about garages, about preventing conversion of garages into habitable space. Because we all know the garages are so small, you can't get your car in them, so they end up being converted. So if I can just start off with those three, so I don't forget them.
Thank you to Councillor Denis. I think Rachel said about it being put as an informative for the liaison group. Would you be happy if that was the proposal?
I have to admit, I prefer conditions, because then you have breaches of conditions. Informatives, I think, is far harder in my view. So I would personally, and I'll take other views, I would want them as conditions, Chair.
I'll refer that then to Rachel, and she can give her opinion on that, and also the parking, because the construction transport management plan was part of the outline application, so it may be contained within that. I'm not sure how much we can do with that within this reserve matters application, but happy for Rachel to answer those if she's able to.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, discussing between us as officers, we do feel that the residents liaison group would sit better as an informative, because for a condition it does need to be strictly necessary in order to be acceptable in planning terms. That is the test, so it is quite a high test in terms of adding a condition. And I would suggest that for that reason it does sit better as an informative. I would note that having had, as I say, some successful liaison already between the applicants, ourselves and the residents, I don't anticipate us receiving a lot of objection to that. I certainly think it'll be quite welcomed by the applicants in due course. So it is your decision, but my advice would be the informative rather than the condition. In terms of parking on site, as alluded to by Councillor Townsend, we would be duplicating conditions on the outline application to impose that. They are required to adhere to the construction, transport and ecological management plan, which has been approved and the outline conditions do form part of the overall permission that they do need to adhere to. So I'd say that we do have those details and controls in place already through those conditions that are imposed there. In terms of a condition to restrict the use of garages, yes, we could impose a condition to that effect if members were minded. The car parking provision overall was relatively generous against our standards. However, clearly, if all of the garages were to be converted, it would fall below those standards. So I think there is a case there, should you wish to impose that point. And that would take the form of a removal of permitted, or rather a condition restricting the use to storage and car parking and no use for habitable accommodation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Councillor Denis, are you happy for the informative for the liaison group and to ask for an additional condition for the permitted development rights for the garages?
I would still prefer the condition, Chair, but I see what my colleagues. I'm happy if the construction traffic is clearly set out in the construction management plan and there's no ifs or buts. As I haven't got it in front of me, I can only take what Rachel says. And I'm quite happy for that last one that you just said about the conversion.
Okay, have you got a seconder for the permitted development rights condition? Councillor Gale, thank you. So Rachel, can we include that condition on the permitted development rights as well when we get to the voting? Thank you. Yes, of course, Councillor
I just
Cossar,
wanted to raise a
to
point because this has come up before and I just wanted clarification. I may be wrong, but I thought when this came up once before, and it's come up on a number of occasions, I thought we actually were given legal advice that because of the high threshold that we've just been talked about, we really wouldn't be able to enforce that as a condition. And therefore, it was something we shouldn't do. I mean, I'm not unsympathetic, but I don't want us putting things in there that we're not actually going to be able to enforce. So could we just see if it is possible to seek further clarification? I thought we'd got legal advice on that before and we're told we couldn't do it.
Is that for the liaison group?
Yes, it is.
Yes, we're just suggesting that's an informative at the moment.
Sorry, I thought Kevin was saying he wanted to press it as a condition.
I said my preference was,
all right,
but it is down to this committee to make the decision.
So Councillor Cossar, are you happy with the other condition on the permitted development rights? You didn't want to speak to that? Thank you, thank you. So if we could include that one, Rachel. Has anybody want to discuss about the informative for the liaison group at all? You're happy for that to be an informative when we get to that point? Councillor Gale.
From what Councillor Cossar said, that was actually spoken about once before. It would be interesting to know if it's legally not possible to have it as a condition.
I think we can ask Lewis. He's on the meeting. Lewis, are you able to provide any comments on that? Thank you. Sorry,
clarify?
Sorry, Lewis, can I just let Councillor Cossar speak and then if you could come in?
Of course, yeah.
I did want to come back to the permitted development. I misunderstood what you were saying. I do actually want to say something about that, but let's deal with the other one first.
Thank you, Councillor Cossar. We'll move to Lewis Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to be clear, are we talking about the condition for a liaison group?
At the moment, we're talking about the condition for the liaison group. Obviously, we're discussing whether or not an informative would be a better,
yes, or
whether we could condition it. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I agree with officers that that an informative would be preferable over a condition. I don't think, as a general rule, a liaison group couldn't be secured by a condition, but I think there would need to be proper justification for going down that route. And I think members would need to really argue that there were special reasons in a particular for a particular application that required such a liaison group to be set up, and I think those reasons would have to be fairly fairly sound, which I'm not sure any such reasons have been discussed as of yet. I think really looking at the tests for a lawful condition, I think the one that sticks out is it being necessary, really to the extent that it's needed in order to make the application acceptable in planning terms. And I'm not sure that case has really been made out here. Hence why I think an informative would be preferable. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Members, does anybody else want to discuss about the informative for the liaison group? No, okay. Councillor Henry, we can come back to you when you're summing up at the end of the discussion. Thank you. Councillor Cossa.
Sorry, I probably misunderstood. The permitted development, is this the suggestion that Councillor Dinas was making, that because the garages are likely to be so small, that we only allow them to be used for storage and so on, and not for habitable accommodation? Is that what's being proposed? If it is, I'd just like to make an observation really. I'm not sure whether the condition is being suggested because we have decided or taken a view that these particular garages are much smaller than usual or any other garage. But if that is not the case, then it does seem to me a quite interesting precedent. We deal with lots of applications here with garages included. I have to say, I'm not at all keen on all the applications that keep coming forward for converting garages into habitable accommodation. But it seems almost that if we do go down this route, that we are establishing, at least for the committee, a precedent that says, pretty much on all new developments, unless there's a particular reason here, we are not going to allow that to happen. And I'm not necessarily even against that, but I'd just like the committee to be clear exactly what we're doing, because I don't remember at any time in the committee seeking to impose the same condition on any of the other detailed applications we've had in front of us.
Thank you, Councillor Cossa. Councillor Gale, and then Rachel perhaps will be able to answer any queries. Thank you.
Yeah, on the subject of the garages, I know from recent experience with the Whitley Neighbourhood Plan, we actually asked that we preferred carports as opposed to garages, because the carports on new developments would be used to park a car, whereas garages invariably they're just used for clutter, or they become another bedroom. I don't think we're saying that this development, the garages are smaller than usual. I think we're just anticipating that we're going to lose car parking spaces when it seems fairly limited on the whole site, if they are all turned into home offices or bedrooms. I think that's what we're looking at, really.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Perhaps Rachel would like to make a comment. I mean, I might just make one small comment before we just move to that, in that obviously the pressure, if there was any overspill parking onto the green, would be quite catastrophic really for this area. So I think that perhaps needs to be taken into account as well. Rachel, can you answer as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and if we do go down the route of imposing that condition, I'd suggest that would be one of the reasons for doing so, both in terms of avoiding inconvenience to other road users and in the interest of the visual amenity, in terms of avoiding lots of cars parked on the curb or on the street where they've intended otherwise, just to perhaps help the debate in terms of the numbers for you. So it is set out in the report, but we've got a total of 145 car parking spaces, and of those, you're looking at 48 of those which are allocated garage parking spaces. So if all of those were to be converted, it would take you below the 111 minimum requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Councillor Darcy.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be setting a precedent. I'm pretty sure we've done conditions like that before on other sites.
Yeah, I think you're correct, Councillor Darcy. I think we have done, although I can't remember at this moment which sites that they were. So, members, does anybody else want to make any comments? Councillor Seaborn. Thank you, Councillor Forozeshki.
Thank you, Chair.
going to start by saying thanks for the site visit, because putting everything in context was hugely helpful. It looked completely different on the ground to what it looks like on paper, so that was helpful. I've just got one point relating to one of the conditions, the wording of the conditions, and the officers know this is coming, so hopefully there's a prepared response. Condition 3, I find vague to the point of being almost unenforceable. It's the broadband, and it refers to putting in the highest available speed broadband infrastructure. It doesn't say highest available where. I wonder if officers could maybe just tweak that very slightly to just make it slightly more meaningful, so that maybe highest available in Ewhurst at the time of installation, something that's reasonable but more enforceable. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rachel. Would that be okay to be able to tweak that slightly, the wording?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think we could add the highest available local broadband, because otherwise it's not specific enough about what we're looking to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Denis.
Thank you. Having just given a couple of points, which I thought were going to be easy, you didn't come back to me. So can I now?
I'm so sorry. Back to you.
Thank you. Just I've got some other observations, if I may, over the report. Page 11 of our agenda shows the proposed street scenes. I mean, even with my eyesight, that was quite difficult to actually see what it's going to really look like. I have to admit, I was quite shocked on the huge distances between some of the premises, which didn't quite tally up looking at the map. So they've obviously picked the best ones they could, but I'm not so sure that's really indicative of the whole site, but there we go. That's just an observation. Okay. I think we need to just talk about the spaces of some of these properties. And I've looked at the Appendix 1, which is the accommodation schedule. And I have spoken to Rachel earlier on when we tried to work out which plot was which one. But I have to say that the majority of the plots that are for the affordable, for example, plots 19, 24 and 25. So you're talking about the 2-bedroom, 4-bed space, 79.4. And then you look at some of the market ones, they're 96.3. You know, and it's pretty consistent across the whole of the place that the affordable is smaller. And, you know, I've said it before, I think it's quite shameful on developers who do that, because we're trying to integrate people into our communities, and that's the polar opposite. So shame on them for doing that. I'm really not very happy about that at all. I mean, you look at one of the 4 bedrooms where the national standard is 124, it's now 197.6. I mean, you know, this is about profit. I've got to say it, rather than what's right for the residents. So I think that is not good at all. Going through the report a little bit more, it says about the condition for electric points has been done for the houses. I'd just like confirmation for the blocks. There's also, the condition does cover that. I couldn't find that. I'm sure it is, but that's just a very, very quick item. I have to admit, part of this is about the appearance that we're looking at tonight, and looking at the pictures and everything else, I'm not 100% sure I really know what the appearance is going to be like at this site. I can see the layout. I can't really see the appearance. I'm not 100% sure what materials are being used. So I do think we should have had more information about that. I'm not so sure I can support the appearance, because I don't actually know what it means from this report. A question for probably Rachel. There's lots of mention of the buffer from the eastern edge of the scheme. And I'm not really sure, because it seems to have been reduced. But what I haven't really worked out is, so what does that actually mean? What's the impact of that reduced buffer? Or is there an impact? I couldn't really find that out. Looking at the SMAR, so looking at the housing mix. So we look at the 1 bedroom, we're planned to have 10%, we got 0. For 2 bedroom, 30%, we've actually got less than half. 3 bedrooms about right. And 4 bedroom, i.e. the ones that's worth the most amount of money, we've gone from 20 to 47%. Again, that seems to me about profit rather than what's actually needed for the area. If there is a need for big 4-bedroom houses at that location, I would have liked to see the evidence for that. But I think it is totally skewed from the strategic housing market assessment. And again, on that reason, I couldn't support it because it is so flawed. Talks about Surrey Police asking for a condition for, recommends a condition requiring secured by design. Again, Rachel, it may well be in the original documentation. I haven't seen that, nor an informative about that at all. I think I will just double check my notes if I may. I have to admit, I'm quite disappointed with this. Yeah, I really am. It doesn't seem to be meeting the needs of a local rural community. It seems to be about money rather than what is actually needed. I just think having those large houses actually is quite overbearing for that site. I'll leave it there, Chair, because I've had my say.
Thank you, Councillor Demas. So, Rachel, could you get back about the EV charging points for the apartment buildings and also the point on the variation from the SMAR and also the secured by design point as well. So 3 points for you there. Thank you.
Yes. I think the AONB was asked about as well. If you wanted me to touch on that briefly in terms of impacts. I'll start with that point actually in terms of the AONB and the AGLB. Because the plan we had at the outline stage was indicative, we didn't have level of detail in terms of how many trees that facilitated, how mature those trees were. They were very much indicative plans. So in terms of the level of detail I can give you, it was those measurements earlier in terms of going through and seeing how wide that was. What it affects is the ability to provide a landscape transition, I suppose, between the open fields and the housing development. Clearly, the impact on the AONB primarily is stemming from those 49 dwellings, and that was considered and approved and considered acceptable by the inspector. So it's really a question of the degree to which you can soften that impact through the amount of tree planting which is achieved. And it was the officer recommendation that the appropriate balance is there in terms of the amount of trees that is able to be reduced. So it's that sort of matter of judgment as to the impact of that buffer and what reducing it does have. Moving on, you'll take your point next about the recommendation of the police crime design officer. You're quite correct, and that is an error. There should be an informative on there, so I'd be happy to add that to the recommendation in terms of encouraging them to apply for the secure by design point on there. So apologies for that. In terms of the electric vehicle charging points, it does specifically refer to every dwelling, so therefore it does include flats and houses, not just the individual units coming forward. So that does accord with the most up-to-date requirement that Surrey are requiring at the moment. And as I say, we can emphasise that further by adding an informative to directly applicants' attention to those parking standards, because there is sufficient flexibility within that wording to encourage them to meet the highest charging points in due course. The condition itself, if you're looking for it, is actually on the outline permission, so that's why you won't see it at the end. It's condition 7 on the outline application. However, based on the wording of that, it is worded as such that it will be one charging space for every dwelling, and we can push for the highest, for high-speed charging points in accordance with Surrey standards at the moment. I don't have a lot to add in terms of the housing mix. You're quite correct in terms of your assessment of there being a high number of the 4 and the 5 bedroom units being higher than what we look for in the SMAR. And whilst there is a degree of tolerance, we do recognise that as a negative aspect to the application. So it does require an overall judgment as to the scheme as a whole, and whether on balance you think that is acceptable, or whether or not it is a point to refuse the application on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Councillor Denis, yes.
Just come back on one point, this has been mentioned, the ANOB. So it's page 20, the second from bottom paragraph, and it might be just, having read so many documents in the last few days, I might be seeing double. It says the ANOB officer has raised objection on the grounds of the impact of the development on the setting of the AONB. This objection makes specific reference to the more limited scope of the landscape buffer. So can I take it from that the ANOB officer still objects to this application, or is there somewhere else I had missed where they change it?
No, that is correct. There is an objection from the AONB officer to the current proposal.
Thank you. Councillor Foraszewski.
Thank you, Chairman. These applications are always very difficult because they are reserved matters and the outline has already been approved. So it becomes, I agree with Councillor Denis that a lot of these applications that we see, it is all about profit, you know, and then is there anything wrong with that? I don't suppose it is, because they've got bills to pay like everybody else. But I do feel that we as a borough, as a council, should be pushing to make sure that our standards are pushed to the maximum. And if anyone listened to the briefing last night about affordable housing and the need, it was frightening to look at those statistics that, you know, a house in this part of the country is worth twice that of anywhere else. And, you know, young families on moderate incomes really don't stand much of a chance of doing very well if we're up against the sort of things that we're up against here. And I do think it's about profit. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but at the end of the day, we as a council, I think we have a moral duty to ensure, and this is where the liaison group comes in. And I think that should have been or would have been looked at the outline stages. But I strongly believe that when we're looking at allocating the proportion of affordable houses, and it was said last night by the head of the department, you know, why aren't we talking to our housing team to actually say to the applicant, this is what we want, not what you want, is what we want to meet the need within the villages and make them of a standard that we're actually proud of. Where I have a slight problem with this, and I know as a substitute, I haven't got the full background on it, and I didn't have time to look back on it because the invitation came quite late in the day. We've got a condition here about permitted development on outbuildings and all the rest of it. But my concerns are, if we look at the street scenes again, some of those houses, have they got permitted development to go into the roof? Could they make modifications? Go back to a point that Councillor Darcy made. I remember an application where we put restrictions by conditions to ensure that there was no permitted development on some new builds. So we have actually done that before. And I think what we see with these new estates is they evolve over time and they never look like 10 years down the line what they look like on the sheet. So it's all right having permitted developments for our garages, but you might find some of these street scene houses with 2 or 3 bedroom, 2 or 3, 4 bedroom houses now have got loft conversions with dormer windows in that turn them into those 3-storey houses that were never here. And I'd like to see some safeguards in here that do make sure that we are protecting the look of this estate for the years to come, because this is a very rural part of the borough, which I think it will massively impact on the street scene. So they're my observations. Thank you for your tolerance and thank you for listening. And as I say, it is all about profit. Can't get away from it, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Councillor Foraszewski. Can I just say to Rachel regarding the permitted development rights restricting them in the roofs? I mean, obviously this is a sensitive site, as Councillor Foraszewski has pointed out, and the visual impact from the AONB could be quite significant potentially. So would we be able to put that forward as an additional condition?
We can do, yes. Essentially, it's a balance to consider what the impacts of implementing those PD rights are. Primarily, you're looking at roof extensions on the rear of the roofscape, whereas if you look at the street scenes and the impact towards the AONB, it's the front elevations that are facing there. So there are some safeguards, I would just emphasise, within the permitted development rights. However, it is certainly open to you, and we have done it before, as you say, to to require the removal of PD rights, which specifically would be Class B in terms of roof extensions on the proposed dwellings. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Forzeski, did you want to?
Chairman, yes, thank you for letting me come back, and most definitely if there's an opportunity to remove those permitted developments, I would like to see that happen.
Thank you. Okay, members. I'd just like to ask a couple of things, Rachel, before we go to the vote very quickly. I just have a couple of concerns about the root protection areas on the eastern side of the sites, and I just wanted clarification from you about the position of the bike storage areas there, and whether or not they are within the root protection area, whether that's covered under the condition.
Thank you for the question. I think it's the western side, which means so it's on that left-hand side, isn't it? Where it's backing onto the TPO. So yes, the cycle sheds which you saw, we might be a bit of a way off getting it up on the screen, but when we had the parking plan up, it does show that the outbuildings or sheds do locate them within the root protection area, because they're on those back corners just under where you'll see the green shading over them. So they would be subject to the conditions outlined previously in terms of controls over the construction method. And essentially, as they're fairly lightweight structures which don't require those solid foundations, it is something that can be mitigated, and that's the reason why we haven't got an objection from our tree and landscape officer in terms of that impact, and they do consider that can be mitigated. Thank you.
And sorry, yes, I was on the western side. On the eastern side, on the buffer there, I know that obviously in the original application the buffer was bigger on that side, and it is reducing down. Is that now covered under the Councillor Darcy's condition for the additional details of the length? Would we be able to you know, get more details of the planting that would go on there? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the point that was raised previously was more about the ecological management measures, and that's what generally goes into the landscape ecological management plan. So no, it wouldn't directly, I mean, what it couldn't do, for example, is sort of alter the layout in terms of what goes on that eastern boundary. We do have quite detailed planting schedules for that boundary, which we have considered are appropriate. So it would be a separate condition if you felt that you wanted to see revised landscaping details, to change it to say we need a revised landscaping scheme come in. That would be the way of gaining additional control along that side. However, I'm not sure if the point's been suggested that there is a particular fault with the trees being proposed. It's more a case of, obviously they are limited by the size of that buffer, and I think it was more about that than necessarily the particular tree species. But if I'm wrong and you would prefer to see a revised landscaping scheme come forward, then a condition to require a fresh landscaping scheme would be the way forward in that case.
Thank you, Rachel. Can I just ask, the landscaping scheme present that's been decided along there, which included hornbeam and other species, has that been consulted with our tree officer?
Yes, that's correct, it has done. And so when your agenda report, you'll see reference to a number of plans listed there in terms of condition plans. So as I say, we can change it if you feel there's a need, but as officers, we did feel that was an appropriate mix that was being put forward.
Thank you. No, I'm satisfied if it's been consulted with the tree officer on that one. Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Darcy, thank you. Before we go back to Councillor Henry.
Yeah, I just wanted quickly to ask a question. There's one of the houses has got a special roof void for the brown and long-eared bats to roost in. I presume that has some special arrangement whereby they can't redevelop the roof of that house, because otherwise it would sort of make it pointless, really.
Thank you. It's a good question. So they would still, future occupiers would be subject by that landscape ecological management plan in terms of having that requirement. However, if we are to impose this additional condition limiting conversion of the roof space, it's certainly going to be an additional measure to help secure that and avoid any confusion for future occupants as well.
Thank you. Councillor Darcy, are you hoping for a condition for that?
Well, if you're going to do a condition on developing the roofs, then perhaps that would be included.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. Councillor Reid, Councillor Gale, and then we need to go back to Councillor Henry to sum up. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't come on the site visit because I was a parish councillor in Ewhurst for 8 years. So I think I know this area quite well. Now, the first couple of points I want to make is this is a very special village. It's very pastoral with its agricultural history, and it's extremely rural, and it's right on the very, very edge of Waverley. And we need to think about all that in relation to this development, because the eastern side we were just talking about has, I thought, very sparse landscape shielding or whatever, because this land slopes down towards the Ockley Road. You can actually see it. You know, this will stand out with all these buildings that we see on page 11 in the landscape, especially before things have grown up. I don't know quite how, you know, it's important that the other areas are landscaped and they've got the mature trees, but we do need to consider the impact of all these houses upon the rural and pastoral areas, which is historic for this area. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you very much. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Councillor Gale, that's the last speaker, and then go back to Councillor Henry. Thank you.
Just very quickly on safety. I believe there's proposed to have low level lighting through the triangular shape, but not on the entrance to the actual development. Is that correct? I'm wondering if that's entirely safe, if you have no lighting at all along there for young people that are walking home at night or something.
Thank you for the question. I believe there is some low level lighting around where those two dwellings are on the access road. But yes, you're right. The focus is to pull the lighting away from that entrance to try and maintain the existing dark sky character. And yes, that is a balance obviously between safety of pedestrians walking around.
Would that come up under the Surrey Police having a look at this?
It may well do as part of their secure by design approach, look and check the appropriate lighting. Then that will also then need to be submitted the full details of lighting to the Surrey Wildlife Trust. So between the two, yes, there is that approach to ensure that.
I think we also have Lewis Jones who would like to come back on a point. So I'll go to Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise a concern about potentially relying on housing mix as an issue with this application. I know that obviously we haven't got to a determination yet, but I know that a couple of members have mentioned it. There appear to be a couple of appeal decisions that I've seen where inspectors have actually concluded that housing mix shouldn't fall within the definition of reserve matters, particularly size and scale. With one inspector actually noting that while the number of bedrooms contained within a dwelling is proportional to its size, it would be a stretch to argue that local authorities should have influence over the configuration of internal accommodation. So I think the implication there is that actually it's an issue that is better dealt with at the outline stage, either through the imposition of conditions or through a 1 of 6 agreement. So I guess I was just raising a small concern there, that if it subsequently becomes relevant after members make their recommendation, possibly we can talk about it further then. But I just wanted to raise it now while open debate was going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you for that point. Councillor Howard, could I ask you to be brief? Thank
yes,
you.
It's very brief. It's just pointing out the supposition that lighting equals safety. Chamberlain Green is often quoted as the safest village in the safest county. We do not have a single light. And I have read police reports, old ones, that there's no proof that lighting equals safety. So.
Thank you, Councillor Howard, and I'm sure that Ewhurst quite likes not having any street lighting as well. So Councillor Henry, would you like to come back?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.
Ewhurst has 3 lights within the whole of the village. That's how dark we are, yeah. And one of those is outside the parish church. Right, okay then. I'm going to pursue my request for these conditions because I do feel they are quite important. The first one, the formation of the liaison group, and my justification is the unlawful behaviour of the applicant. Right. I probably don't need to say anything more. And the second one, with regard to the trees and safeguarding the area behind the properties 21 to 29, although condition 9 talks about a protective fence and to the roots, it wouldn't include the branches, and some of those branches are probably, I don't know, 20, 30 feet long. And we have incidents in the village where a developer has just taken a chainsaw to overhanging branches. So that's why I feel it's very important that probably that second one regarding the trees, the ribbon on the boundary fence, could be accommodated within condition 9. And as I say, I do feel very strongly about the formation of the liaison group with the track record of the developer to date. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Henry. I do believe that the trees in question that you're referring to, which is the plots 21 to 29, are all actually now covered by TPOs. Perhaps Rachel could just confirm that. And with regard to the liaison group, again, if we have had advice from Lewis Jones, which pointed out that we needed to have sort of special circumstances. So again, Rachel, I would just perhaps run that one past you before we move to the vote. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. I must admit, I'm not entirely sure what additional protection you want to put on there because in terms of the tree condition. So on that left-hand side of the scheme, those permitted development rights are running now from the base of the access road up north, and they do follow the full extent of the TPO boundary. So that is just one of the protection measures there. And condition 9, which you're referring to, is specifically looking at how those units are constructed. So that includes where the tree protection fencing goes and looks at like the no dig protection there. So I'm open to what you might want to add to that, but my advice would be that we do, between those two conditions, you have got quite a strong safeguard there in terms of protection on those trees. And any work to trees, whether that's be to branch, pruning of branches or the trees, they do need a TPO works application to come into the council, is my understanding. My only quick point in terms of the liaison group, not too much on the merits of the informative or condition because that's already been discussed, but just to say in terms of the works that are being referred to having taken place on the site already, it is the demolition of numbers 44 and 45, the 2 existing units on site. For a development to be unlawful, they would have had to have had an enforcement notice served on them and failure to comply with that notice. We're not in that position at the moment. So just to be clear, that officer's advice is not that there is any unlawful action taking place, albeit some monitoring and investigation was taking place once those 2 units came down, because they form part of this proposal, essentially the demolition of those units. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. There's just one really quick point, sorry, going backwards a little bit, but the LEMP condition needs to be subject, because it's likely to be a pre-commencement condition, would need to be subject to agreement with the applicant, because the way that pre-commencement conditions are now structured means that you do have to get agreement with the applicant for putting that on. If we were unable to get agreement, then I think that would be a matter we would then come back to the committee with. But so the recommendation for that element needs to be subject to agreement with the applicant or the applicant's agent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just to say that the to clarify the point in the TPO, Councillor Henry, it has been extended now, so it is across the whole length of that area from plots 21 to 29. Before there was a little bit which wasn't covered. Yes, Councillor Henry.
I just come back. I can see that the fence is there to protect. I can see that the excavation and the roots are dealt with, but it's everything above that
Yes,
area.
and that is covered by the TPO, so they would have to apply for works to be done because those trees are all now covered by the TPO. So I think we do need to get to the vote now.
Okay.
So members, subject to the revised conditions within your update paper, and also subject to revised condition 3 regarding broadband, and also the additional condition for the LEMP to agree with the applicant, the condition for the permitted development right for the removal of permitted development rights for the garages and also for the roof space, and then the informative for the liaison group, and also the informative for the secure by design. Have I picked up everything there?
The only additional one was the informative drawing the appellant's attention to the Surrey County standards for electric vehicle charging points.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that. So members, that subject to the completion of a deed of variation to secure updates to the affordable housing provision by the 8th of June 2022, and subject to conditions, as I've said, 10, 11 and 14 on this update sheet, and conditions 1 to 6, 8 to 9, 12 to 13 on the agenda report, and the other conditions and informatives that I've already outlined, that reserved matters approval is granted. Could I ask you to show by show of hands, please? Any against? Any abstentions?
It's 10 for and 1 abstention.
So that application has been granted. Thank you. So we can now move on to the next. Sorry, Councillor Costa. Yes, of course. Can we have just...
Excuse me, Chairman, before you take a break, can you just deal with recommendation B, just for the formality, that in case...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And recommendation B, as set out in your agenda report. Apologies, I need to get to that point. In the event that the requirements of recommendation A are not met, that permission be refused for the following reason: the applicant has failed to enter into an appropriate legal agreement to secure the provision of affordable housing within the meaning of the NPPF, appropriate to meet Waverley Borough Council's housing need. The proposal would therefore fail to create a sustainable, inclusive and mixed community, contrary to policy AHN1 of the local plan part 1 and paragraph 64 of the NPPF. Could you show by way of a show of hands? Thank you. Thank you, members. That's 11 for that recommendation. And yes, could we have a quick comfort break for a couple of minutes and then come back at 19:46, please? Thank you, members. Could I ask you to take your seats, please? Thank you. I think, do we have everybody back? Are we missing someone? Have everyone back? Thank you, Fiona. So, members, moving on to the next application, we have WA 2021 02518, which is the Music Works New Road, Godalming. And we have our officer, Lara Davison, who's going to be presenting to us. Thank you, Lara. Okay, sorry everyone, we've got the same technical hitch on the laptop, so we'll just move over to the other laptop. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to.
Thank you, Chair.
That's okay. Laura, are we waiting for any other officers to join us?
I have one verbal update before I start my presentation in section 4 of the officer report, which should have read implemented in December 2020. That was just a copy and paste error on that one, so apologies for that. So this application proposes the erection of a place of worship following the demolition of the existing building. I would note that the site has previously been granted the change of use to a place of worship under application reference WA 2019-0693. Press to change it. There we go. The site is shown here via the red line on the location plan, which is positioned on the corner of New Road and Portsmouth Road, and it's also located within the rural settlement of Milford. Here is the aerial plan. As you can see, it's located adjacent to a hair salon and a roofing supply shop. Also along New Road down here, you can see there's Milford Baptist Church and also the veterinary hospital. These are photographs of the site taken from across New Road, showing the existing design of the building, as you can see here, in comparison to the surrounding buildings along New Road and Portsmouth Road. The photo on the left provides a view down New Road, as you can see the hair salon here. And the photo on the right is taken across Portsmouth Road. As you can see from the photos, the existing building lacks architectural interest and is positioned on a prominent position on the junction of New Road and Portsmouth Road. This slide. Here is the existing site plan showing the existing building and the number of car parking spaces available to serve the place of worship currently. I will come back to this plan as a comparison in a few slides' time. Here is the existing elevations of the place of worship. The existing structures you can see in the photographs consist of flat roof and a white cladding. Here is the proposed site plan, including the reduced size of the building and also the increased number of parking spaces available on site. Here are the proposed elevations for the scheme, proposing a single-storey place of worship. External materials would consist of brickwork, plain tiles, which are consistent with the surrounding dwellings in the locality. This final slide shows provides a comparison between the existing and the proposed site plan. On the left is the existing, on the right is the proposed, which demonstrates clearly the reduced footprint of the place of worship, which allows an increased number of parking spaces on site and the ability for those visiting the site to visit and enter and leave in a forward gear. There are 8 car parking spaces available existing, and the proposed development would have 12 parking spaces, also including a disabled parking space. Officers would note that the council's parking guidelines require 1 car parking space for 10 seats. Taking into account condition 8, which restricts workers to no more than 30 at any one time, officers consider that with 12 spaces provided, this would exceed the guideline requirements, which would actually only require them to provide 3 spaces. The key matters for consideration are design and visual amenity, impact on the rural settlement, and impact on residential amenity and parking. Officers are recommending approval of the application, subject to conditions and formatives set out in the officer report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lara. And this application is subject to public speaking, and we're joined via Zoom by Alison Shrimpton. Hopefully Alison can hear us. You have 4 minutes. When you have 30 seconds left to go, you might hear a beep to warn you that your time is nearly over. Passing over to you. Alison, you're on mute at the moment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, indeed.
Hello. So I'm Alison Shrimpton and I run the hairdressers next to Music Works at the moment. Obviously my main concerns are we are a very small salon and the Music Works being knocked down. It's the noise level for us. You know, we just had 8 months of being locked down because of COVID. So we are just getting our business back into operation. We have a beauty room at the back of my salon. So obviously the noise of the building is not going to be relaxing in any shape or form for any of our clients. So that I'm concerned that it's not going to make our business viable and our clients will go elsewhere, because obviously you are supposed to be coming in to be relaxed. Banging, drilling, etc. is not particularly relaxing at all. My second massive concern is the parking, because we have issues already with parking. So if my clients are unable to come and park, we have elderly clients. If they are not able to park, they are going to go elsewhere. Without our clients, we don't have a business. And obviously that is a massive concern for myself and my colleagues. Also speaking to the clients that are coming into the salons, they are obviously concerned as well that that they are not going to be able to park. That is, I don't have a problem with the church per se. They've been very reasonable. The reason that it works at the moment is because we are allowed to park in their spaces. If they are going to be knocking down and building, where is everyone going to be parked? Where can we park? There isn't any extra parking for us. That's my concerns.
Thank you, Alison. And so over to members to discuss. Councillor Gale.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also the ward councillor for Milford, so I've been spoken to quite a bit about this application because New Road notoriously has lots of parking on the roadside, and there has been lots of new development in New Road recently. I think everybody would agree that aesthetically the building would be more pleasing than what's already there. However, we've had some queries on the run up to this, and I must thank the officers very much for coming back to me on things. If I can just say, one of the things is the opening times. They were granted permission for a place of worship back in 2019, I think it was. And if you look at the opening times on that granting, there were 40 hours per week that they were granted to be open. The new application is extending all the opening hours, and if you add them up through the week, it's 71 hours, which is quite a big increase in the opening times, especially when you bear in mind that they actually state that they will worship for approximately 3 or 4 times a week, lasting approximately half an hour or so at a time. That's 2 hours of worship. The meeting room, yes, is designated to take 30 persons, and as we've heard, 10 spaces is allegedly adequate for bringing 30 people. Maybe they drive minibuses. I don't think these people that come to worship here are local, so I think most of them will be driving. So I think we would have an issue with parking. I don't know that for 100%. One of the things about the timings is when the condition was placed on the original application for the timings to be restricted on certain days, the reason given was it was in the interest of the character and amenity of the area, in accordance with policy TD1 of the local plan 2018 and policies D1, D4 of the Waverley Borough local plan. One of the increases is to 6 AM on a Sunday, which I don't think is very conducive to people having a lay-in on a Sunday at 6 o'clock in the morning to hear voices and car doors, because it's very close to the housing. Highways matter. The ladies just actually said about parking, which is a very big problem. And I see Highways have actually said that everyone should enter and exit the site in a forward motion. Looking at the plan, that's actually not possible for a couple of the vehicles because there are cars parked behind them, and they would probably have to back into those 2 spaces off of the road, or if they enter them in a forward motion, they're going to be reversing out into New Road. The dropped curb goes quite an extensive way along the frontage, and at the moment people drive in and reverse out, so they are using that long drop curb and reversing onto the road, and I can't see that changing. So there are quite a few problems really, and I think the people in New Road, there are new dwellings which aren't complete right opposite. They haven't been inhabited yet. That's going to be more parking on the roadside because there isn't adequate parking on the site. So I think we need to sort of represent the problems that the people in New Road have regarding the parking and the times of opening, and what the building is going to be used for those excessive amount of hours, 71 hours, when they're going to be worshipping for 2. So I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Lara, could we just pick up about the point about the construction and the construction? Is there a construction management plan condition on this for disruption to adjoining premises? And also, perhaps if you could touch on the justification for the extended hours, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So if I start with the construction transport management plan, originally Highways didn't suggest one, however we have gone back and negotiated one which is added as condition 10, which is a pre-commencement condition. So they would be required to submit a construction transport management plan to include the details which are set out in condition 10 prior to commencement of works, which officers consider are reasonable given the position of the construction on New Road and concerns with the parking. In relation to the additional opening hours, officers consider it's reasonable given the reduction in size of the building and the increased number of parking spaces. Also, you might note there's a bit in an application in Farncombe where we allowed unrestricted opening hours, and that was considered reasonable. So given this circumstances where they're not requesting 24 hours opening, they're requesting hours where they can use the facility for these 4 services, but also if you use it for certain other things, so they're not restricted, which officers do consider it reasonable to allow this on this site. Thank you, Chair.
And the last point by Councillor Gale as well, sorry, I forgot to say, was about the parking and for the adequacy. I think you touched on that in your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have gone back to the County Highway Authority, who are satisfied with the plan that there is sufficient room for cars to enter and exit in a forward gear. So that plan has been assessed by the Highway Authority, who are satisfied. So I can't add anything further to that point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lara. Councillor Cossa.
Thank you very much, Chair. I do know this site very well. I used to live at the other end of New Road for many years, and parking has always been an issue in this area, largely caused by the fact that many of the residences simply do not have parking provision. And I don't think you're ever going to solve it. I accept we shouldn't be looking to worsen it. But if I look at the application in front of us, clearly there is, as Councillor Gale has recognised, a significant plus in terms of providing building that looks something like, compared to what has been an eyesore at the top of New Road for many, many years, at least in my view, and I think in the view of most people who have lived in that area. The hours, I think, is quite interesting, actually. I was going to instance the Farncombe application, because I do remember we had a very similar debate around this, and the view that the committee took was that it wouldn't be appropriate to try and get the church, in a sense, to be prescribed to the specific times in which they might worship. So I'm not desperately fussed about that, because what I thought I was hearing, and I'm happy to take further clarification on this from either the officers or Councillor Gale, was that the actual usage of the site would be quite limited. That's what we anticipate. The fact that they have 71 hours does not mean, and I don't think anyone's seriously suggesting this, unless I've misunderstood it, that they are going to use that for 71 hours per week. I was taken by the point that our speaker made. I think some of that, I'm afraid, is inevitable when you are involved in construction work of any kind, if it's properly agreed, and that, you know, neighbours and businesses and so on are impacted, and I don't know how much we can do about that. But I did just wonder whether what I didn't understand is whether it would not be possible for that business to make an arrangement with the church for use of those spaces at particular times. I have no idea when they want to use it and when they want to worship, and any clarity on that might help. But that's just a sort of side thought, really. I wouldn't want to see the business, you know, go under. None of us would want to see that, and maybe some of that parking provision would help. But I must stress again, there's always been parking issues in that area, and I'm not sure that they're necessarily going to be exacerbated. I think what I'm essentially saying, Chairman, is it seems to me there are quite good planning grounds for agreeing this application. There will be some impacts and inconveniences, but I'm not unduly swayed by the thought that they should sway our judgment as to support for the application on planning grounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. Councillor Reid, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. And just a quick point, is this planning permission for a place of worship, or is there another reason for using this planning application for the use of this building? Are they perhaps planning to let it for activities with other people in the community using the facility? Is there a limitation, or can you explain that, please? Because 71 hours is an awful lot of worshipping. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. I think, Lara, would you like to answer that? Thank you.
So the building as it stands was granted to be a place of worship in 2019. This application would not change the use. It would have a place of worship use, which I believe is use class F. what the applicant or the user of the church does within that 71 hours wouldn't really be a planning matter. I don't have much else to add on that. There is a condition 3, which reads the premises should not be used for any other purpose as defined in the use clause order F1 in brackets small f, so they wouldn't be able to change the use within that use class, so there is a restriction on that being a place of worship. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lara. Councillor Reid, does that answer your question?
Well, I think then that the car parking could be shared, couldn't it? But that doesn't solve the problem of the nuisance with the noise of the redevelopment, which is, I know Councillor Cossa and I agree it will be inevitable, but it will be an improvement, but surely they can come to some arrangement perhaps. Thank you.
I think you're right, Councillor Reid. I think that would have to be a private arrangement for any shared parking and doesn't come under this this application. I don't know whether or not it is possible to encourage the developer to share their programme of works with local businesses so that they are able to perhaps gauge when they can perhaps encourage clients to book a different time if there's going to be some particularly noisy works going on. Is that at all possible?
I did note in the speaker that they do currently have some form of informal arrangement over sharing parking. So given that they're the same applicant, it wouldn't, although it's not a planning matter and something I think we probably couldn't include, it seems strange that wouldn't carry over into the new application.
And do you think they could share their programme of works with perhaps Chris? Thank you. Could you answer?
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the parking arrangements, they are purely a civil matter and not a matter for us to comment on in terms of the planning application. So in terms of whether they would share those or not, that is not for us tonight to consider. In terms of the timings of certain construction works where there are noisier works, for instance, maybe things to do with demolition, then we could encourage that for an informative, that they share that information. So I think what I'd suggest to be an additional informative, encouraging discussion about timings of construction works. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Darcy.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the issue of the hours, because it seems to me one of the key things here is that there's existing condition hours which were set up presumably when the permission was first given. So the question then is, what has changed to mean that the hours should change to such an extent that they have? And I would argue that given it's a place of worship, nothing. So I'm a bit surprised, and especially surprised by the idea that 6 AM on Sunday is considered to be unacceptable in a built-up area like this. And I can't see why anyone would want to be worshipping at 6 AM on the Sunday, quite honestly. You'd have to be very keen. So I'm personally, I think that we should revise those, because I think 6 AM is just not fair on the other people. I wrote down in my notes, I said, 6 AM is crazy early. And that's how I feel about it. And if I was a neighbour, I would not be pleased. And in fact, they'd probably get a mouthful from me at some point if they did disturb me at 6 AM on a Sunday. So we don't want that sort of thing to happen. I think it's unwise to allow to change the conditions to the extent that they're being proposed. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. I shall remember not to ring you at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I think the officers said that because of the reduction in the size of the actual footprint, that justified extending the hours. However, if you wanted to propose something different hours, that can be open to discussion by members for the Sunday hours.
Well, I would propose that 8 AM was early enough on a Sunday, to be honest. I mean, it's too early for me, but let's be reasonable. I know lots of churches do 8 AM service or 8:30 services.
Okay, Councillor Darcy, so you're proposing 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock on a Sunday. Have you got
It's to 1, actually.
which were 9 till 1, I think, on a Sunday.
Yeah, isn't it 8 till, isn't it now 6 till 1? Oh, okay.
If you could come through the chair, Councillor Gale, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, no, I'm not suggesting that they stick to the original ones, because I can see that if you want to have evening services, that's unreasonable. But I would suggest that on a Sunday, yes, that they should start later.
Okay, Councillor Darcy. So I'm getting the idea that you wanted to propose 8 o'clock start till 6 on a Sunday. And have you got a seconder for that proposal? Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to, any member want to discuss that point? Yes, Councillor Cossa.
Yes, I do. I'm quite uncomfortable actually about the thought of us seeking without good reason to restrict the hours in which you know, a church should hold its services. And I would remind the committee that when we considered the similar application in Farncombe, that is in at least as built up a residential, and I would argue more built up, because it's right in the middle effectively of a whole series of terraced houses, the church that we were looking at, whereas at least this is offset to some extent at the top of New Road. And I can't vote for that proposal for those reasons. I think we shouldn't interfere in when they do. I don't get any impression that they're going to act unreasonably, not that, you know, that's necessarily part of our judgment, but because Councillor Darcy doesn't, you know, like to wake up early in the morning and so on, I think that's a bad basis on which to make the amendment.
I'd just like to point out that there were existing hours imposed by the previous people who gave the permission, so it's not me who's inventing the idea of imposing hours.
Thank you, Councillor.
And they were there already.
Thank
I'm
you,
just
Councillor.
suggesting that the amendment, a slight amendment to them.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. We have the amendment, we have it on the table. Councillor Denis and then Councillor Gale.
Thank you. I wasn't intended to speak, but I think from the last comment, Councillor Costa said we shouldn't be changing without good reasons. Well, actually, I haven't heard any good reasons why we should change them. And I think the only point that's been put, well, it's a smaller building. Well, what? I'm sorry, I can't see the relevance. If it's a smaller building, why you'd need longer hours? So, although I've heard all the arguments, I just haven't heard any reasons why they should be increased. If there are good reasons, I'd love to hear them. If not, I would support an amendment to the hours.
Councillor Gale.
Yes, the restriction on the number of people allowed to worship before was 30 in the bigger building. The restriction on the number of people allowed to worship is 30 in a smaller building. That doesn't mean you need longer hours just because the building has changed in size. In my view, I think the original hours that were designated due to the amenities of the people around it should be implemented on this one.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Sorry, Councillor Costa, would you like to come back? Yes.
Only to say that everything that's been said presupposes that we got that right and debated it properly first time. It does, just because that was what was agreed last time, it doesn't mean it's right. We need to look at what the situation is in now and ask ourselves whether it is the right thing to do. And I understand people may have different views, but let's not just base our arguments on what there was before. Let's take a judgment about what is right.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. I think I'll go to Laura and Chris, because they might have a comment on this as I can hear them talking away.
Thank you, Chair. I think one thing that I'm conscious of when I'm looking at that hours condition is that it's relating to the operation of that building at all, and actually restricting them too much. There might be certain preparations and things that they have to do, and it's not to say that they are going to be operating it intensely at those times. So yeah, my thoughts are that it is reasonable to extend those hours, because it's not saying that they're going to, you know, the reason that they're after that is not necessarily to be, you know, to be doing intense activity at all of those times. It's just because to allow them to use the building over that period. I hope that makes some sense. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I think, to be honest, there seems to be a little bit of sort of disagreement perhaps in the room. So perhaps on this particular point, the proposal from Councillor Darcy was to just for the Sunday to change the time to 8 until 6. So perhaps we just need to have a show of hands to gauge the support for Councillor Darcy's amendments to the conditions. So all those in favour of reducing it to 8 o'clock to 6 on the Sunday hours, would you like to just have a show of hands on that? And those against that?
We have 6 voting for and 5 voting against.
Okay, so the 4s have that one then. So the proposal is that the on condition, I think it's condition 3, that the Sunday hours, the proposal is to change those to 8 o'clock. Unless I can't see Lewis's hand up or anything. So if we go on with the rest of the application, then does anyone want to speak to any part of the application? Yes, Councillor Gale.
I'd like to talk about the parking because I'm not convinced they will all be able to park within their curtilage there. And I think the parking will spill out onto New Road. Is there anything we can do to say that there will be no roadside parking allowed, or is that not possible?
I think Lara has outlined, you know, that it does meet our requirements. So I think that that would be unreasonable really as a condition, and will probably be unenforceable, to be honest. So I personally don't think that there's any way we can do that. I don't know whether Lara has got any additional points she'd like to make on that.
I don't have anything additional to make, otherwise just to emphasise that our parking guidelines do say 1 car parking space for 10 seats. Now, if we're restricting it via condition 8 to 30 seats, then really we can, the guideline suggests 3 spaces. They are providing 12 spaces, which is an increase from 8. So they're not changing the use, they're providing a smaller building with an increased number of parking spaces. So the situation is going to improve. We're not allowing more people into the building, we're just allowing more car parking spaces, so which still exceeds the guidelines previously and now exceeds them by an additional 4 spaces. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lara. And Councillor Costa, your last turn back.
But what about condition 7? I mean, the Highways Authority have recommended that there should be an updated parking management plan to include details of car sharing, methods to minimise the need for cars to park on the public highway, to be in accordance with the scheme, to be submitted and approved in writing by the local planning authority. I thought that wouldn't that just achieve what we want to achieve? And I mean, there's been no real reference to that. And to me, that was always central, that they are going to do their best to try and get that right. And they specifically asked for that condition to be imposed, which is not usually what highways do. They usually just tick it. Sorry, no.
Thank you. Yes, so condition 7, the parking management plan, should cover those details. Thank you, Councillor Costa. I don't think that we can impose probably any other conditions regarding the parking at this stage. So members, do we want to go to the vote on this one then? So let me just scroll down to the... Sorry, could you just remind me, Lara, what page the recommendation is on? 57, thank you. Thank you, page 57, thank you. So the recommendation is that permission be granted subject to the following conditions. And obviously there is, the conditions are all outlined there, subject to the amendment to condition 3, which is condition 4, which is just scrolling down on my iPad, sorry. That is to change the operating hours from the Sunday to 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the evening. Yes, and the informative with regard to the sharing of information for the construction programme with local businesses And right, members, can I ask you to have a show of hands, please? Those all in favour of that recommendation?
For.
Those against?
1 against.
Any abstentions?
None.
So that is agreed. Thank you, members. Is that okay, Lara? Moving on to the next application. I'll just let officers change their seats. So now we have the application WA 2021 02397, which is for 135 George Road, Farncombe. This application is not subject to public speaking. And I'm going to hand over to Susie Blackwood, who is.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, Susie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 135 George Road, Farncombe has been brought to committee as it falls outside the scheme of delegation as the agent is related to a member of staff. The proposal is for a single-storey rear extension. The application site is located on the northwestern side of George Road. The property is a semi-detached 2-storey dwelling. This is an aerial view of the property location. These photos show the relationship between number 135 George Road and neighbouring properties. The application proposes the erection of a single-storey rear extension. The rear extension would measure 4.7 metres deep by 4 metres wide with a ridge height of 3.4 metres and an eaves height of 2.5 metres. The proposal is of a similar size to the existing rear single-storey element of the building. As you can see, it's slightly narrower. The ridge height is slightly higher. So the main matters for consideration are the design aspect. The proposal won't be visible from the street scene, and there won't be any impact on residential amenity since it's just replacing an area of built form that's already there. So officers recommend that permission be granted subject to conditions.
Thank you, Susie. Members, any questions at all on this? No? Okay, thank you. So the recommendation is that permission be granted subject to conditions 1 to 2 outlined on your papers on pages 68, found the pages this time, to 69, and the informative, one informative as well. So members, can I have a show of hands if you agree to this application?
For.
Any objections?
No objections.
Any abstentions?
No abstention.
So that permission is granted. Thank you. So moving on to the next application, which is WA 2021 02137, which is the Tile House, Mellish Hill Road, Wonersh. And we have presenting this one, it's Monica Vistate, is she? It's not as on my paper. I did wonder, I hadn't seen Monica online. So yes, handing over, Dan, sorry. Sorry, Dan, apologies.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. There are no updates to the report This application is under section 73 to vary conditions 1 and 2 of WA 2021-0247, which are for approved plan numbers and restrictions on external materials, to allow alterations to the roof design of the single-storey rear extension and changes to the materials originally proposed with this element of the scheme. The application has been brought before the Planning Committee as the application has been submitted by an agent who is a relative of a member of staff, and the application falls outside the council's scheme of delegation. Officers consider the proposal to be acceptable with regards to impact on character. Therefore, the application is recommended for approval. This slide shows the location plan. The application site is located to the south of Malash Road within a residential area of low density. Tile House is a large 2-storey detached dwelling that sits on a large plot of land with generous front and back gardens. This slide shows the aerial view, which shows the position of Tile House pinpointed in the centre of the aerial shot. The land where the proposed alteration is located is over the conservatory identified on the bottom right-hand side of the dwelling. This slide indicates both block plans for the extant consent and the proposed development. The drawings demonstrate that alterations to the proposed rear extension would be relatively modest, concerning alterations to the roof design and materials. The slightly revised single-storey extension dimensions are shown on the slide. As you can see, the alterations in depth, width and height are very minimal indeed. These are some photographs of the site. Photographs 1 and 2 show the front and rear elevations of Tile House. Photograph 3 shows the original conservatory to be built over, and photograph 4 shows the most recent photo of the rear elevation with the extant consent part implemented. This slide shows the consented elevations of the Tile House. The rear elevation indicates a rear extension with a flat roof and 2 roof lanterns. So just the bottom right there. And then for the proposed elevations, the proposed roof form would have a crown pitch with 1 roof light. The proposed materials would comprise facing brickwork, clay roof tiles and ridge tiles for the roof, compared with the flat roof of single ply membrane and roof lanterns. The floor plans compare the consented plans against the proposed plans, and as you can see, the alterations there are barely noticeable at all. The roof plans show the altered roof form with the consented proposal with flat roof and 2 lanterns on the left, and the proposed crown pitch on the right. The main matters of consideration are the principle of development. This was established by the granting of WA 2021-0247. Officers have been mindful of any material changes in planning circumstances since the granting of the extant consent in March 2021. There are no changes which would be relevant to the reconsideration of this application. There has not been a material change in site circumstances since the extant consent. However, it is highly material that there is an existing permission which could be implemented on site. Therefore, it would be inappropriate and unreasonable to revisit the principle of the entire development. As such, the assessment made under the extant consent with regards to the following issues would not be affected by the variation in these conditions, and the original assessments and conclusions on these remain. And these concern the impact on the green belt, residential amenity, highways and parking, impact on a low density residential area, biodiversity and very special circumstances. Therefore, the matter to consider is the impact on design and visual amenity. And for the reasons outlined within this presentation and within the report, the proposed alterations would be modest
and would be acceptable. The application is recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dan. Members, does anybody want to? Councillor Denis.
Thank you for that really good presentation. It's probably more of an observation. It seems that this has come to us because the agent is related to a member of the staff, and I'm just not so sure having this amount of members looking at issues that are because they fall out the delegation is the right way of doing this. So it's probably more of a plea that maybe outside this meeting that these type of applications where it's just a technical because of a relation, there must be a better way and better use of our time. So when we do have committee meetings, we actually can concentrate on the issues that are important. And I just, that's no criticism, because I think it was a really good presentation, but I'm not so sure it's good use of 10 people's time when we have so many other sort of contentious. So could I ask you as the acting chair just to take that issue away? And I'm sure my colleagues would agree, as long as we still got transparency, and I'm sure we would another system, but just have a look at it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Denis. I'm happy to take that back. Yes,
Just quickly, I had the same thought, but I wasn't going to articulate it. But part of the reason for that is I haven't actually been able to come up myself. I've thought about this many occasions when we have these things, about how you provide the transparency, because that, of course, is the key. When it is a member of staff, it clearly can't be decided under delegated authority. And the only option I see is committee. Whether it requires our officer time to make the presentation is maybe one area we can look at, but other than that, I don't actually see a way around it. But let's take it away, as you say, and we'll have a look.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. So if we move to that vote then, so the recommendation is that permission be granted subject to conditions 1 and 2 and 1 informative. Could you indicate by show of hands whether you agree to it? Thank you.
For
I think that's unanimous. I'm not sure I need to go through the objections and abstentions. So thank you, members. That application is granted. There's nothing else on the agenda. So good evening, members, and thank you very much.